On March the 17th, 1933, a former butcher named Josef Dietrich handpicked 120 men to stand guard outside a government building in Berlin, replacing the regular army soldiers who had traditionally held that post for generations. Nobody watching them take up their posts that day could have predicted what those same men and the unit that grew from them would eventually become across the following 12 years. This is not a story about soldiers protecting a leader from foreign enemies. It is the story of how Hitler's own personal bodyguard became a weapon first turned against Germans themselves, years before it was ever turned against the rest of Europe, and a decade before it left one of the war's most notorious atrocities behind it, on a Belgian roadside. This is the story of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the unit that began as 120 hand-picked guards and grew into one of the most feared armored divisions of the entire Second World War, and the uncomfortable truth that its first real test of loyalty had nothing to do with any enemy soldier at all. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Josef Dietrich made an unlikely candidate to build Hitler's own most trusted force, a background that stood in sharp contrast to the aristocratic academy-trained officers who still dominated Germany's own traditional military establishment at the time. A former butcher with brief First World War service behind him, undistinguished by any particular battlefield achievement his own later biographers ever managed to identify, Dietrich joined the Nazi Party in its earliest years and rose through its ranks not through formal military training or aristocratic connections, the traditional paths to command in the German officer corps, but through a single, uncomplicated quality that mattered more to Hitler than any staff college credential: absolute personal loyalty demonstrated repeatedly and consistently over years of political street fighting before the Nazi Party ever actually took power. When Hitler ordered the formation of a full-time armed guard completely devoted to himself rather than to Germany's own traditional military hierarchy, a hierarchy Hitler himself never fully trusted, despite his own growing political power over it, Dietrich was the man he chose to build it, selecting each of the unit's first 117 to 120 men personally, several of them veterans of an earlier, smaller bodyguard formation that had protected Hitler as far back as 1921, men whose own loyalty predated the Nazi Party's actual rise to national power by more than a decade. The new unit, designated SS Stabswache Berlin, took up its post at the Reich Chancellery that March, replacing the regular army guards who had traditionally held that duty, a quiet but deliberate signal that Hitler now trusted his own hand-picked men over Germany's own established military, a symbolic substitution few outside observers at the time fully appreciated the longer-term significance of. Before we get into the moment that actually revealed what this unit was truly capable of, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The unit's formal test of loyalty arrived considerably sooner than anyone standing guard outside that Berlin building in March of 1933 could have anticipated, and it came not from a foreign army, but from within Hitler's own political movement, a threat considerably closer to home than any conventional bodyguard unit was ordinarily designed to address. By the summer of 1934, the Nazi Party's own paramilitary organization, the Sturmabteilung, commanded by Ernst Röhm, had grown into a massive force of several million men, dwarfing the regular German army in raw numbers, and Röhm himself, once one of Hitler's own closest early allies and a fellow veteran of the failed 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, had begun pushing for the SA to absorb Germany's regular army entirely, a demand that alarmed both the traditional military establishment, whose own generals Hitler still needed to court, and Hitler himself, increasingly wary of a rival power base commanded by a man he could no longer fully control. On June the 30th, 1934, in an operation that came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler traveled personally to Bad Weisse alongside Dietrich and a detachment from the same unit that had begun as his own bodyguard, to personally oversee Röhm's arrest at the lakeside resort where SA leadership had gathered. Members of the unit that had sworn loyalty to Hitler only months earlier participated directly in the purge that followed, a wave of arrests and executions that eliminated Rome and the SA's own senior leadership within days, conducted with a speed and coordination that surprised even some of the traditional army officers who had quietly welcomed the SA's own destruction. The unit that had been built specifically to guard Hitler's body had, within roughly a year of its own founding, been used to help eliminate men who had once marched alongside him, a reward for that loyalty following almost immediately in the form of official recognition and expansion. Heinrich Himmler renamed the unit Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler the following spring, deliberately inserting the SS initials into its own name, specifically to make unmistakably clear that this force answered to nobody but Hitler and the SS structure built around him, entirely independent of the SA whose own leadership it had just helped destroy days earlier, a renaming that formalized in official nomenclature exactly what the purge itself had already demonstrated in practice. The unit's own emerging identity found physical expression in a small but symbolically loaded detail few outside observers noticed at the time. Its adopted symbol, a skeleton key, honored Dietrich personally, since the German word for skeleton key or lockpick, Dietrich, happened to match his own surname exactly, a small institutional joke that nonetheless reinforced the unit's own deeply personal character, an organization built around and named for the loyalty of specific individual men rather than any broader institutional mission or national symbol. That same emblem would later be retained and modified to serve as the insignia for the entire 1st SS Panzer Corps once the Leibstandarte had grown far beyond its own original modest size, a small design detail that traveled, largely unremarked, from a single bodyguard unit's own internal culture into the official heraldry of a much larger fighting formation. The unit's own recruits arriving through the following years often described their own motivation in terms considerably more mundane than the ideological fervor popular memory sometimes assumes drove every SS volunteer into uniform. SS Unterscharführer Erwin Bartmann, who joined the Leibstandarte in May of 1941, later recalled that as a Berliner he had never doubted he would volunteer, having seen the unit repeatedly on parade through the city and on guard at the Reich Chancellery itself, drawn as much by the unit's own polished uniforms, its evident comradeship, and its physically imposing recruits, every man at least 1.82 meters tall, as by any deep political conviction of his own at the time he actually enlisted. That same ordinary, almost aspirational motivation, wanting to belong to the smartest-looking, most impressive-seeming unit in the entire German capital, a matter of local pride and personal ambition as much as ideology, sat alongside a growing body count that had, by the time Bartmann himself actually volunteered in 1941, already stretched from a single night in Bavaria in 1934 to battlefields across occupied Europe, a gap between individual motivation and institutional history that historians studying ordinary SS recruits have since found repeated across thousands of similar personal accounts. The Leibstandarte's own military growth across the following decade mirrored the wider expansion of Hitler's own ambitions almost exactly, each new campaign bringing both territorial expansion for Germany and further institutional growth for the unit itself. The unit fought during the Anschluss, absorbing Austria in 1938 without significant resistance, took part in the invasion of Poland the following year as an independent formation still finding its own footing as a genuine combat unit rather than a purely ceremonial guard, and was formally folded into the newly organized Waffen SS alongside other SS combat formations, including the SS Verfügungstruppe and the SS Totenkopfverbände, before the invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1941. By the middle of 1942, the unit had grown from its original regiment-sized force into a full Panzer Grenadier division, considerably larger and more heavily armed than the ceremonial guard detachment it had begun as barely a decade earlier, and by October of 1943 it had achieved its final form as a complete Panzer division, one of the most heavily equipped and most fanatically loyal armored formations in the entire German military, fighting through the brutal urban combat at Kharkov, the massive armored engagement at Kursk, and eventually the increasingly desperate defensive battles that defined the war's final collapsing year on both fronts simultaneously. That same division's own wartime record, expanding across nearly every major campaign of the European war, from the Anschluss through the final battles for Berlin itself, carried with it a parallel history of atrocity that historians have since documented in considerable detail, from surviving records, post-war testimony, and the trials that eventually followed Germany's own defeat. The Leibstandarte is estimated to have killed roughly 5,000 prisoners of war across the length of the conflict, the overwhelming majority of them on the Eastern Front, where the war's own brutal, ideologically charged character made such killings both more common and, within German military culture at the time, more readily tolerated by superior officers who might otherwise have intervened. That pattern of conduct remained consistent with the same absolute, unquestioning loyalty to Hitler's own ideological worldview that had first been tested and proven at Bad Wiessee a decade earlier, a worldview the unit's own institutional culture had never meaningfully departed from across every subsequent campaign it fought. That pattern reached its own most infamous Western Front expression during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, when a battle group from the division under Colonel Joachim Peiper murdered American prisoners of war near the town of Malmedy, an atrocity that became widely known within days across the Allied lines, and that this channel has already covered from the perspective of the wider offensive. It occurred during an offensive whose own broader failure this channel has already documented in considerable detail. The same unit whose own founding myth rested on absolute personal loyalty to a single man had, across more than a decade of continuous service to that same loyalty, left a trail of civilian and prisoner deaths stretching from a Bavarian lakeside in 1934 to a Belgian crossroads in 1944, a consistency of conduct across radically different circumstances and radically different victims that historians have generally identified as the clearest evidence available of exactly what kind of institution the unit's own founding principle had actually created. The original 117 men Dietrich personally selected outside that Berlin building in March of 1933 went on to occupy a remarkable share of the wider organization's own later command structure, a fact that speaks directly to how thoroughly the unit's own founding culture propagated outward as the war expanded. Of that original small group, 3 eventually rose to command entire divisions in their own right. At least 8 became regimental commanders, 15 commanded battalions, and more than 30 rose to company command, a genuinely striking rate of advancement for men who had begun their own service simply standing guard duty at a single government building rather than pursuing any conventional military career path through Germany's own established officer training system. That advancement pattern meant the specific culture of absolute personal loyalty Dietrich had instilled in his own original recruits did not remain confined to a single unit as the war progressed, but spread outward through the broader Waffen as those same men took command of other formations entirely, carrying the same founding principle with them into commands considerably larger and more consequential than the ceremonial guard duty they had all originally signed on for. This is not a story about elite soldiers who simply fought well and happened to serve an evil cause, a framing that risks flattening a considerably more specific and more uncomfortable truth about exactly how this particular unit's own institutional character actually formed. It is a story about what happens when an armed force is built, from its very first day of existence, around personal loyalty to one individual rather than any broader institutional or national loyalty, a structure that proved itself willing, from its first real test at Bad Wiessee onward, to turn its own weapons against anyone that individual designated as an enemy, foreign soldier, domestic political rival, or unarmed prisoner, without any of the traditional institutional checks a conventional national army, however imperfect, might have provided against exactly that kind of order arriving from the very top of the chain of command. Sepp Dietrich himself survived the war to face trial for his own role in the Malmedy massacre, convicted by an American military tribunal at the Dachau trials in 1946 and initially sentenced to life imprisonment before later parole, living out his remaining years never fully escaping the reputation of the force he had personally built from 120 hand-picked men outside a Berlin government building more than 3 decades earlier. Colonel Joachim Peiper, the officer whose own battle group carried out the killings at Malmedy specifically, was likewise convicted at the same trials, and though his own death sentence was eventually commuted, he too spent the remainder of his life associated inescapably with a single afternoon's atrocity on a snow-covered Belgian road. The Leibstandarte, formally disbanded with Germany's own surrender in May of 1945, left behind a name that remains, among historians of the Third Reich, one of the clearest available illustrations of exactly how far a bodyguard unit could travel once absolute personal loyalty replaced every other institutional loyalty an armed force might otherwise have been built around. A journey that began with 120 men guarding a single building's front door and ended 12 years later, with war crimes tribunals still working through the consequences of exactly what that original loyalty had actually been used for once it was finally tested at scale. If you want more stories about the forces built on loyalty to one man rather than any nation, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.